The discovery. The silence hit Jake Morrison first. That unnatural, suffocating quiet that settles over the Oregon wilderness when something has gone terribly wrong. Even the river seemed to hold its breath, its usual rushing whisper reduced to a nervous murmur against the rocks. Jake lowered his camera, his photographer's instinct screaming that something massive had disturbed the natural order of this place. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, breathing, labored, wet, desperate breathing that rattled through the Douglas firs like a dying engine. He'd heard animals die before during his years as a park ranger. This was different. This was something fighting against death, with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. Jake Morrison had built his life around solitude. At 34, he'd traded his ranger uniform for a camera and a cabin 20 miles from the nearest town. The divorce 2 years ago had stripped away everything except his daughter's photograph and his need to disappear into places where human voices couldn't reach him. His ex-wife, Sarah, kept their daughter Emma in Portland, where schools and stability mattered more than a father who talked more to trees than people. The locals in Cascade Ridge knew him as reliable, level-headed, the guy who'd help pull your truck out of a ditch but wouldn't stay for coffee. Nobody would ever accuse Jake Morrison of chasing fantasies or spinning wild tales for attention. He'd come out here to document the elk migration, nothing more. 3 days into the backcountry, with enough gear to last a week, capturing images of the herds moving through the Santiam River Valley. The money from wildlife magazines kept his cabin heated and his truck running. The solitude kept him sane. He'd been following what he thought were elk tracks for the better part of an hour when the prints changed, became something else, something that walked on 2 legs and left impressions in the soft riverbank mud that measured 18 inches long. Now Jake stood frozen at the edge of a rocky clearing, his rational mind trying to process what his eyes were reporting. The creature lay collapsed on the riverbank like a fallen monument. Its massive form sprawled across the smooth stones. 8 feet tall, maybe more if it could stand. Covered in matted dark brown fur that glistened wet in the filtered sunlight. But it was the face that stopped Jake's heart. Not an animal's face. Not quite human either. Something in between. Something that shouldn't exist outside of campfire stories and blurry photographs that skeptics love to debunk. The creature's chest rose and fell in shallow, struggling gasps. Deep gashes tore across its torso, the fur around the wounds dark with blood that looked disturbingly red, disturbingly human. Jake's medical training from his ranger days cataloged the injuries automatically. Severe lacerations, probably blood loss, possible internal damage. Whatever had done this had meant to kill. The creature's eyes opened. Just a crack, just enough for Jake to see the intelligence burning there. Pain, yes. Fear, absolutely. But also awareness, recognition. The kind of look that said this being understood exactly what was happening to it. Their eyes met across 15 feet of rocky ground, and Jake felt something shift in his understanding of the world. This wasn't an animal. This was someone. His hands moved on instinct, raising his camera. The shutter clicked 3 times before his conscious mind caught up with his actions. Documentation. Evidence. Proof that he wasn't losing his mind in the wilderness. Then the photographer in him died away, replaced by the part of him that had spent years helping injured hikers and wounded animals. This creature was dying. Whatever it was, whatever impossible category of life it represented, it was bleeding out on the rocks while Jake stood there taking pictures. He approached slowly, hands visible, voice low and steady. the same tone he'd used on spooked horses and frightened children. The creature didn't move, didn't threaten, just watched him with those two intelligent eyes, as if measuring whether this human meant harm or help. Up close, the injuries looked worse. The gashes were clean, too clean. Not claw marks, not teeth. Something sharp and manufactured. And there, embedded in the creature's shoulder, the unmistakable shape of a dart. Military grade, the kind used for large animal tranquilization. The kind that shouldn't exist in civilian hands. Jake's fingers fumbled for his cell phone. No signal. Of course no signal. 20 miles from the nearest tower, in a river valley that swallowed radio waves like a black hole. He looked down at the creature, at the blood still seeping between the rocks, and felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on his shoulders. He could leave. Hike back to his truck, drive to town, tell someone. By the time he returned with help, the creature would be dead. Or he could stay. Try to stop the bleeding with his limited supplies and hope that whatever had injured this being didn't come back to finish the job. The decision made itself when the creature's hand moved, slowly, painfully, until its fingers rested against Jake's boot. Not grabbing, not threatening, just touching. A gesture that transcended species, that said please in a language older than words. Then Jake heard the helicopters, distant at first, but growing louder. The distinctive thump of military rotors echoing off the canyon walls. He looked up through the canopy, catching glimpses of black shapes moving in formation across the sky. No markings, no identification numbers, just black metal insects hunting for something in the forest below. The creature's grip tightened on Jake's boot. Its eyes, clouding with pain and exhaustion, held a warning that Jake understood perfectly. Those helicopters weren't coming to help. They were coming to finish what they'd started. And if they found Jake here, bearing witness to something the world wasn't supposed to know existed, he'd become a problem that needed solving too. Jake's first instinct was to run, to put distance between himself and whatever operation those helicopters represented. But the creature's grip on his boot held him in place, not through force but through the desperate plea in that single gesture. He'd made his choice the moment he'd approached instead of fleeing. Now he had to live with the consequences. He worked quickly, tearing his flannel shirt into strips while keeping one eye on the sky. The helicopters were circling in a systematic grid pattern, each pass bringing them closer to this section of the river. Jake pressed the makeshift bandages against the worst of the gashes, feeling the creature flinch beneath his hands. The fur was coarse, almost wire-like, but the flesh beneath felt disturbingly human, warm, vulnerable, bleeding the same red blood that ran through Jake's own veins. The creature made a sound, low and rumbling, that might have been pain or might have been communication. Jake found himself talking as he worked, the same steady stream of reassurance he'd once used on his daughter after nightmares. Telling the creature it would be okay, even though he had no idea if that was true. Even though everything about this situation screamed that nothing would ever be okay again. His fingers found the dart in the creature's shoulder, and he hesitated. Removing it might cause more bleeding, but leaving it in meant leaving evidence. Leaving a tracking device, if that's what it was. Jake gripped the dart and pulled. It came free, with a wet sound that made his stomach turn, and he examined it in the filtered sunlight. Military grade, definitely. But more than that, the dart had a small electronic component embedded in its base, a tiny blinking light that Jake's park ranger training recognized immediately. A tracker. They'd tagged this creature like a research animal, and now they were hunting it down using the very device they'd shot into its flesh. Jake hurled the dart into the river, watching it disappear into the current. It might buy them time. It might do nothing. But at least the creature wasn't broadcasting its location anymore. The helicopters were directly overhead now, close enough that Jake could feel the downdraft stirring the branches above. He grabbed fallen limbs and brush, piling them over the creature in a desperate attempt at camouflage. The being seemed to understand, staying perfectly still as Jake covered its massive form with forest debris. He pressed himself against a boulder, trying to make himself small, invisible. Through the gaps in the canopy, he could see the helicopter hovering, a black silhouette against the afternoon sky. A loudspeaker crackled to life, the voice distorted but commanding. Federal operation in progress. All civilians must evacuate the area immediately. This is a restricted zone. Jake's jaw clenched. Federal operation. No agency identification. No explanation. Just authority without accountability. The kind that made people disappear. The creature shifted beneath its camouflage, and Jake pressed a hand against what he thought was its shoulder, urging stillness. The helicopters made 3 more passes, so low that Jake could see the figures inside, men in tactical gear scanning the forest below, with equipment that looked far too sophisticated for a simple search and rescue. They were hunting, and they were good at it. Finally, mercifully, the helicopters banked away, following their search grid to the next sector. But Jake knew they'd be back. Knew that whatever organization was behind this had resources and determination that his improvised hiding spot couldn't withstand for long. He waited until the sound of the rotors faded completely before pulling away the branches. The creature looked at him with those impossible eyes, and Jake saw something in them that made his breath catch. Gratitude, understanding, and beneath that, a desperate urgency. The being tried to push itself up, managed to get to its knees before collapsing back against the rocks. It gestured weakly toward the mountains, toward the deep wilderness where the maps ran out and human presence became a distant memory. Home. It wanted to go home. Jake thought about his truck, parked 2 miles away at the trailhead. Thought about trying to get this massive creature through the forest, across terrain that would challenge a healthy hiker. The being had to weigh 400 pounds at least, and most of that was dead weight right now. But what choice did they have? The helicopters would return. The search teams would expand. And Jake had seen enough in his ranger days to know that operations this secretive didn't leave witnesses. He fashioned a stretcher from his tarp and the sturdiest branches he could find, working with the efficiency of someone who'd conducted wilderness rescues before. The creature watched him work, occasionally making those low vocalizations that sounded almost like words. Jake found himself responding, maintaining a one-sided conversation that felt less insane with each passing minute. He told the creature about his plan, about his truck, about getting them both out of this valley before the hunters returned. When he tried to move the creature onto the stretcher, he quickly realized the futility of his plan. The being was simply too heavy, too large. Even with the creature trying to help, using what strength it had left to shift its weight, the task was impossible. Jake's muscles screamed with the effort, his back threatening to give out. They managed maybe 20 feet before he had to stop, gasping, while the creature made sounds that might have been apology or frustration. They tried again, and again. The progress was agonizing, measured in yards rather than miles. The creature's breathing grew more labored with each movement, and Jake could see fresh blood seeping through his makeshift bandages. He talked constantly now, filling the silence with words, because silence meant hearing how impossible this was. He told the creature about his daughter, about the divorce, about why he'd come to these mountains to hide from a life that had fallen apart. And somehow, impossibly, the creature seemed to listen. Jake dragged the creature another agonizing 20 yards before his arms finally gave out. He collapsed beside the stretcher, chest heaving, tasting copper in his throat. The creature made a low sound, almost apologetic, and Jake found himself laughing despite everything. Here he was, trying to save something that shouldn't exist, hunted by people who shouldn't be hunting it, and all he could think about was how his gym membership had been a waste of money. The trailhead parking area appeared through the trees like a mirage. Jake's truck sat exactly where he'd left it that morning, a lifetime ago. But his relief died the moment he saw the vehicles blocking the access road. 3 black SUVs positioned across the narrow Forest Service road, forming an impenetrable barrier. Men in tactical gear stood at intervals, checking every car that approached, turning everyone away with practiced efficiency and zero explanation. Jake pulled the creature back into the tree line, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through his camera's telephoto lens, he studied the checkpoint. The men wore no insignias, no badges, no identification of any kind. Their weapons were military grade, their movements precise and coordinated. This wasn't law enforcement. This was something else entirely. Something that operated outside the normal rules. One of the men spoke into a radio, and Jake caught fragments of the transmission on his emergency band receiver. Federal operation, hazardous materials, area quarantine. All lies, delivered with bureaucratic smoothness to a public that had no reason to question. The net was tightening, and Jake was inside it. He retreated deeper into the forest, half carrying, half dragging the creature away from the trailhead. His mind raced through options, each one worse than the last. They couldn't go forward, couldn't go back. The helicopters would return with better equipment, thermal imaging that would cut through any hiding spot, and the creature's condition was deteriorating. The makeshift bandages were soaked through, and its breathing had developed a wet, rattling quality that Jake recognized from his ranger days. Infection. Without proper medical care, the being would die out here. The old ranger station materialized in his memory, like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was making. Built in the 1930s and abandoned for decades, it sat in a hollow that most modern maps didn't show. Jake had stumbled across it years ago while tracking an injured elk, had filed its location away in that mental catalog of useful wilderness knowledge that rangers accumulated. If he could get there, they'd have shelter. Time to think. Maybe time to save both their lives. The journey took 3 hours that felt like 30. The creature was fading, its attempts to help growing weaker with each stumbling step. Jake talked constantly, filling the silence with anything and everything. His daughter's last birthday party. The divorce papers he'd signed in a lawyer's office that smelled like old coffee and broken promises. The photograph of a bull elk at sunset that had almost won him a National Geographic contract. Anything to keep them both moving, both fighting. The ranger station appeared through the undergrowth, exactly as he remembered. Weathered wood, sagging roof, windows dark as empty eye sockets. Jake kicked open the door and helped the creature inside, lowering it as gently as possible onto the dusty floor. The being's eyes were half closed now, its breathing shallow and rapid. Jake found the station's ancient medical supplies, praying that antiseptic didn't have an expiration date that mattered. He worked with hands that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline, cleaning wounds, applying fresh bandages, doing everything his ranger first aid training had taught him. The creature endured his ministrations with stoic silence, occasionally making those almost words that Jake was beginning to recognize as communication. When he finished, the being's eyes opened fully for the first time in hours, looking at him with an intensity that made Jake's breath catch. In the corner of the station, Jake found an old radio, the kind that ran on hand crank power. He worked the crank until the battery sparked to life, then scanned through frequencies until he caught the federal channels. What he heard made his blood run cold. They were calling it an escaped subject, calling Jake a civilian witness who'd made unauthorized contact. The language was clinical, detached, but the meaning was crystal clear. They weren't just searching, they were hunting. And their orders included both the creature and anyone who'd seen it. Jake set the radio down with hands that had started shaking again. He looked at the creature, at this impossible being that was bleeding on the floor of an abandoned ranger station, and felt the weight of a choice he'd already made without realizing it. He could walk away, could claim he'd been lost, confused, had seen nothing. The men at the checkpoint would question him, might even believe him. He could go back to his cabin, his camera, his careful isolation from a world that had disappointed him. But then the creature moved, reaching out with one massive hand to touch Jake's camera where it sat on the floor. The being's fingers traced the images on the display screen with surprising gentleness. It paused on a photo of Jake's daughter, taken at Christmas. 8 years old, gap-toothed smile, holding up a drawing she'd made of a family that no longer existed. In the way she'd drawn it, the creature looked from the photo to Jake, and in its eyes was something that transcended species. Recognition, understanding. This being knew what it meant to be separated from family, knew what it meant to be hunted, to be alone, to fight for survival against forces that saw you as less than human. And in that moment, Jake understood that walking away had never really been an option. The creature's hand moved from the photograph to its own chest, pressing against the matted fur where Jake had worked to clean and bandage the worst wounds. Then it gestured outward, toward the mountains visible through the station's grimy windows. The meaning was unmistakable. Others. Family. Out there, somewhere in the wilderness that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Jake stood and moved to the window, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The helicopters had moved on for now, but he could hear engines in the distance, vehicles on the logging roads that crisscrossed these mountains. They were tightening the net, methodical and patient. He turned back to the creature and froze. It was drawing in the dust on the floor. Not random marks, but deliberate symbols. A circle. Lines radiating outward. Smaller circles at the end of some lines. Jake crouched beside it, watching as the being created what looked like a crude map or family tree. The creature touched the central circle, then itself. Then it touched one of the outer circles and made a sound that was almost a word, almost a name. Jake pulled out his phone, hands trembling as he photographed the drawing. He zoomed in on the creature's hand, on the intentional, purposeful way it was communicating. This wasn't instinct. This was intelligence. This was someone trying to tell him something desperately important. The creature continued drawing, adding more details. Mountains, rivers, a specific location it was trying to describe. Jake recognized the general topology, the deep wilderness beyond the Cascade Crest, where even experienced hikers rarely ventured. Territory so remote that helicopter crashes had gone undiscovered for years. A sound outside made them both freeze. Footsteps. Multiple sets, moving carefully through the undergrowth. Jake killed his phone's light and moved to the window. Through a gap in the boards, he saw tactical lights sweeping through the trees. They'd found the station. Of course they had. It was on old Forest Service maps, and these people had access to everything. The creature tried to stand, failed, and Jake felt panic surge through him. They couldn't run, couldn't hide. The being was too weak, too large, too distinctive. In minutes, maybe seconds, armed men would kick through that door and everything would end. The creature would be taken back to whatever facility it had escaped from. Jake would disappear into federal custody. Another loose end tied off and forgotten. Then Jake remembered. The tunnels. Every old ranger station in this district had been connected by a supply tunnel system, dug during the Cold War when someone had decided that forest rangers needed to be able to move supplies underground in case of nuclear war. Most of the tunnels had collapsed or flooded decades ago, but Jake had explored some of them during his ranger days. If this station's tunnel was still passable, it would lead away from here. Maybe far enough to matter. He found the access hatch behind a stack of rotted supply crates, exactly where it should be. The metal was rusted, but the hinges still moved when he hauled on them. Below was darkness and the smell of damp earth. Jake turned to the creature and gestured downward. The being looked at the narrow opening, then at its own massive frame, and Jake saw something like fear cross its face. The footsteps were closer now, voices calling to each other, tactical commands being issued. Jake grabbed his pack, stuffed his camera inside, and climbed down into the tunnel. He looked up at the creature and held out his hand. For a long moment, the being didn't move. Then it dragged itself to the edge of the hatch and began the painful process of squeezing through an opening designed for humans. The creature's shoulders barely fit. Its breathing came in pained gasps as it forced itself downward into the claustrophobic darkness. Jake helped as much as he could, guiding the being's descent, trying to keep its wounds from tearing open again. Above them, the station's door crashed open. Boots on the wooden floor, shouted commands. Jake pulled the hatch closed as quietly as he could manage and turned on his phone's flashlight. The tunnel stretched ahead, narrow and low, shored up with ancient timbers that looked like they might collapse if someone sneezed too hard. The creature was shaking, whether from pain or fear of the confined space. Jake couldn't tell. He put a hand on its arm and felt the rapid pulse beneath the fur. They moved through the darkness, Jake leading, the creature crawling behind him. Every few yards, Jake had to stop and help the being navigate around collapsed sections or standing water. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, a claustrophobic nightmare of wet earth and the constant fear that the ceiling would choose this moment to finally give way. Then Jake's light caught something that made him stop. Footprints in the mud. Recent ones, made by boots. Someone had been down here, and not long ago. He followed the prints with his light and saw more signs of passage. Disturbed earth. A dropped energy bar wrapper. Supplies cached in a dry alcove. The creature made a sound behind him, urgent and warning. Jake killed his light and listened. Ahead, in the darkness, there was movement. Breathing that wasn't theirs. He reached back and found the creature's hand, felt it grip his with surprising gentleness despite its strength. A light flared ahead of them. Jake raised his hands instinctively, expecting tactical lights and weapons. Instead, he saw a single flashlight held by a woman in hiking clothes, her face shadowed, but her voice calm and controlled. "Jake Morrison," she said, and it wasn't a question. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen. I've been waiting for you. We need to move quickly, and I need you to trust me, because in about 5 minutes, this entire tunnel system is going to be full of federal agents who very much want all 3 of us dead." Sarah Chen moved through the tunnel with the confidence of someone who had mapped every inch of it. Jake followed, one hand keeping contact with the creature behind him, feeling its labored breathing vibrate through the cramped space. The woman's flashlight beam cut through the darkness ahead, revealing junction points Jake hadn't known existed. "How long have you been down here?" Jake asked, keeping his voice low. 3 days, Sarah replied without turning. "Monitoring federal communications, waiting for the right moment. When I heard they'd cornered you at the ranger station, I knew you'd remember the tunnels." She paused at an intersection, checking something on a handheld device. "This way. The logging camp exit is compromised, but there's another outlet 2 miles north." The creature made a sound, something between a growl and a question. Sarah stopped and turned, shining her light carefully to the side to avoid the being's eyes. She reached into her pack and pulled out a medical kit, but not the standard first aid variety. The supplies inside looked specialized, almost veterinary, but designed for something far larger than any domestic animal. "I worked at the facility," Sarah said, addressing the creature directly. "Site 7, in the Cascades. I was part of the research team for 4 years, before I couldn't stomach it anymore." She pulled out a syringe filled with clear liquid. "This is an antibiotic compound I developed specifically for your physiology. It'll help with the infection that's setting in." Jake watched as the creature studied Sarah, its intelligent eyes moving from her face to the medical supplies and back. There was a long moment of assessment, of decision. Then the being extended its arm, presenting the least wounded area for injection. Sarah administered the medication with practiced efficiency, her hands steady despite the surreal circumstances. "There are protocols," she continued as they moved forward again. "Contingency plans for exactly this scenario. Escaped subject, civilian witness. The response escalates in stages. Right now, we're at stage 3, which means containment and recovery. If we're not captured within the next 12 hours, they move to stage 4. She glanced back at Jake. "Stage 4 is elimination and cover story deployment." "What kind of cover story?" Jake asked, though part of him already knew. "They're preparing to announce a chemical spill or a wildfire. Mandatory evacuation of 100 square miles. Anyone who refuses to leave gets forcibly removed. Anyone who can't be accounted for becomes a tragic casualty of the disaster." Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, but Jake heard the underlying anger. "I've seen it happen twice before. Entire communities displaced, evidence destroyed, and the subjects either recovered or eliminated in the chaos." The tunnel began to slope upward. Jake could feel fresher air moving through the passage, carrying the scent of pine and the approaching storm. The creature's breathing had steadied somewhat, the medication apparently working quickly. Sarah checked her device again and frowned. "They've found the tunnel entrance at the ranger station. We have maybe 10 minutes before they start sending teams through." She looked at the creature, then at Jake. "When we surface, we'll be in a supply cache I've been maintaining. Food, water, more medical supplies. But we can't stay there. We need to get into the deep wilderness, beyond the perimeter they're establishing." "How far?" Jake asked. 30 miles of roadless terrain, through country that would challenge experienced mountaineers." Sarah's expression was grim. "And we need to do it with a wounded being who weighs close to 600 pounds and is wanted by every federal agent in the Pacific Northwest." They emerged into a small concrete bunker, hidden beneath decades of forest overgrowth. Sarah had transformed it into a well-stocked refuge, with supplies carefully organized and maps spread across a makeshift table. She immediately went to work, treating the creature's wounds more thoroughly, cleaning and bandaging with materials designed for the task. Jake studied the maps while she worked. The marked perimeter was extensive, covering every road and trail within 40 miles. But Sarah had traced a route through the blank spaces between the lines, following ridgelines and game trails that existed only in the memories of those who knew this wilderness intimately. "You've done this before," Jake said. "Helped them escape." "Twice," Sarah confirmed. "Both times the subjects died from their injuries before reaching safety. The program's extraction methods are brutal. They use high-powered tranquilizers that would kill a bear, then transport in conditions that would violate every animal welfare law on the books. Except these aren't animals, and there are no laws protecting them." The creature made a sound, and Sarah responded with a gesture that seemed almost like communication. The being pointed at the maps, then made a sweeping motion toward the northwest. Sarah nodded and marked a location deep in the wilderness. "He's telling us where his family group ranges," she explained to Jake. "I've been studying their communication methods for years. It's not language as we understand it, but it's sophisticated. Gestural, vocal, and contextual. They have concepts for family, territory, danger, help." She paused. "And they have long memories. This one was taken from his mate and offspring 5 years ago. He's been in captivity ever since." Jake felt something twist in his chest. 5 years separated from family. He thought of his own daughter. The 2 years since the divorce that felt like an eternity. This creature had endured more than twice that, in conditions he could barely imagine. Sarah packed supplies into 3 backpacks, distributing weight strategically. She handed one to Jake and kept one for herself. The third, she modified with longer straps that could fit across the creature's massive shoulders. As she worked, she explained what they were facing. "The federal response is being coordinated by Colonel Marcus Brennan. He ran the facility where I worked. He's brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely convinced that these beings represent a threat that justifies any action." Sarah's hands moved efficiently, checking equipment. "He'll have access to thermal imaging, aerial surveillance, and enough personnel to create a net. We'll have to be very lucky to slip through." Thunder rumbled in the distance. The creature lifted its head, listening, then looked at Sarah and made a complex gesture. She nodded and turned to Jake. "He says the storm will help hide us. His people know how to move when the weather turns. We need to leave now, before the federal teams adapt their search pattern." She shouldered her pack and moved to the bunker's exit. "Once we're outside, we don't stop until we've put at least 10 miles between us and this location. Can you do that?" Jake looked at the creature, saw the determination in its eyes despite the pain it must be feeling. He thought about turning back, about the safe choice, about his daughter and the life he'd built in careful isolation. Then he thought about what Sarah had said. 5 years in captivity, a family waiting, not knowing if their loved one still lived. "Yeah," Jake said, adjusting his pack. "I can do that." The storm hit with a violence that transformed the landscape into something primordial and hostile. Rain came in sheets so thick, Jake could barely see 10 feet ahead, each drop striking exposed skin like a tiny needle. Wind howled through the canyon, bending trees that had stood for centuries, their creaking protests audible even over the thunder that rolled continuously across the mountains. Sarah led them up a steep incline, her boots finding purchase on rocks slick with moss and running water. Jake followed, one hand gripping the creature's massive arm as it climbed beside him. The being moved with surprising agility, despite its injuries, instinct overriding pain. Every few minutes it would pause, head tilted, listening to something beyond human hearing. "Thermal imaging is useless in this," Sarah shouted over the wind. "The temperature differential between us and the environment disappears. We're invisible to their best technology." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest in stark white flashes that made the shadows leap and dance. In one of those flashes, Jake saw movement on the ridge behind them. Figures in tactical gear, at least a dozen, picking their way through the storm. They were being followed, but the weather had bought them precious time. The creature made a low sound and changed direction, pulling them toward a rock face that seemed to offer no passage. But as they drew closer, Jake saw the opening, a narrow crack in the stone barely wide enough for a man. The creature gestured urgently, and Sarah nodded. "Cave system," she said. "They use them as waypoints. Safe places. Go." Jake squeezed through the opening, his pack scraping against stone. Inside, the sound of the storm became muffled, distant. Sarah came next, then the creature, its bulk barely fitting through the gap. They moved deeper into darkness, Jake using his phone's flashlight to illuminate rough stone walls that glistened with moisture. The cave opened into a larger chamber, and Jake's light revealed something that made him stop. The walls were covered in markings, handprints pressed into clay that had hardened over what must have been decades or centuries. Symbols scratched into the stone, patterns that suggested meaning, intention, culture. The creature moved forward, its breathing heavy but steady. It reached out and placed its hand against one of the prints on the wall, fingers aligning perfectly with the ancient mark. The gesture was reverent, almost religious. When it turned to look at Jake and Sarah, there was something in its eyes that transcended species, a connection to history and heritage that any human could recognize. "Sacred place," Sarah whispered. "They've been using these caves for generations. We're close to their territory now." They rested for 20 minutes, letting the storm rage outside while they caught their breath. The creature sat against the wall, its hand still touching the ancient markings. Sarah checked its wounds, changing bandages that had become soaked. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but infection was setting in despite her treatments. The being's skin was hot to the touch, fever burning through its system. "We need to move," Sarah said quietly. "Another 6 hours, maybe 8, and we'll be in the deep territory. But he's getting worse. I don't know if the medicine I have will be enough." Jake watched the creature trace the symbols on the wall with one massive finger, following patterns that clearly held meaning. "He's come this far," Jake said. "He'll make it the rest of the way." When they emerged from the cave, the storm had begun to ease. Rain still fell, but the wind had died down, and the thunder was moving east. They descended into a valley thick with old-growth forest, trees so massive and closely spaced that even in daylight the forest floor would be dim. Now, in the storm-darkened afternoon, it was nearly black. The creature took the lead now, moving with more confidence. They were in familiar territory, and despite its injuries and fever, something in its posture had changed. It was heading home. They'd been walking for 3 hours when the creature suddenly stopped, one hand raised in a gesture that clearly meant danger. Jake and Sarah froze. Through the trees ahead, lights flickered, moving in a coordinated search pattern. Voices carried through the damp air, distorted but clearly human. Sarah pulled them behind a massive fallen log, its trunk easily 8 feet in diameter. They crouched in the space beneath, pressed against wet earth and rotting wood. The creature's breathing had become labored, each exhale a soft wheeze that seemed impossibly loud in Jake's ears. The lights grew closer. Jake could hear them now, soldiers communicating in short, professional bursts. They were sweeping the area in a grid pattern, methodical and thorough. One team passed within 20 feet of their hiding place, boots squelching in the mud, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The creature tensed, and Jake felt its muscles coil. For a moment, he thought it might bolt or attack, but instead it went absolutely still, not the stillness of a human trying to hide, but something deeper, more fundamental. It was as if the being had become part of the forest itself, its presence fading into the background of natural sounds and shadows. The soldiers passed, their lights moved away, voices fading into the distance. But more teams were out there. Jake could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their search. The federal forces had established a perimeter, and they were tightening it. "We can't keep avoiding them," Jake whispered. "Eventually they'll box us in." Sarah's face was grim in the dim light. "We don't have to avoid them much longer. Once we cross into the deep territory, the terrain becomes impassable for their vehicles. They'd have to follow on foot, and these beings know this land in ways no human ever could." The creature made a soft sound and pointed ahead toward the northwest. Through the trees, Jake could just make out a change in the landscape, a rise that suggested mountains beyond. Home was close, but so was the enemy. They had to run a gauntlet through hostile territory, and time was running out. The valley opened before them like a hidden world, a canyon carved by ancient waters and sheltered by walls of stone that rose hundreds of feet on either side. Jake's breath caught as they descended the final slope, the creature moving ahead with renewed strength, despite its injuries. The settlement wasn't what he'd expected. No crude shelters or primitive camps. Instead, natural caves had been carefully modified, their entrances partially concealed by living curtains of moss and vine. Flat stones had been arranged to create pathways between dwellings, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Figures emerged from the shadows, massive forms that moved with cautious grace. Caro called out, a sound that was part vocalization, part something deeper that Jake felt in his chest rather than heard. The response was immediate. A female rushed forward, smaller than Caro, but still towering over Jake, and behind her came a young one, perhaps 4 feet tall, its fur lighter brown and eyes wide with wonder and recognition. The reunion was silent but profound. Caro embraced his mate, their foreheads touching in a gesture so human it made Jake's throat tight. The young one wrapped small arms around Caro's leg, and the wounded creature bent carefully to lift its child, cradling the small form against its chest, despite the pain the movement must have caused. Other creatures gathered, forming a loose circle around the newcomers. Jake counted 15, maybe more in the shadows, all ages, all sizes, watching with intelligent eyes that held caution and curiosity in equal measure. An older creature stepped forward, its fur grizzled with silver, moving with the careful dignity of great age. Deep scars marked its face and arms, testament to a long life in a dangerous world. Sarah began making gestures, slow and deliberate, that the elder creature seemed to understand. A conversation unfolded in silence, hands and expressions conveying meaning across the species barrier. Jake watched, fascinated and humbled, as Sarah explained their journey, the pursuit, the danger that followed them here. The elder's response was measured but clear. It gestured to the canyon, to the caves, to the gathered family groups. Then it pointed toward the entrance they had used, and made a sweeping motion that Jake understood meant soldiers, danger, death. The creature knew what was coming. They'd been hiding for generations, and now their sanctuary had been discovered. Ka-Ro set down his child and approached Jake, moving slowly as if every step required concentration. When it reached him, the creature placed one massive hand on Jake's shoulder, the gesture gentle despite the strength in those fingers. Its eyes met Jake's, and in them, Jake saw gratitude, sorrow, and something else. A question, perhaps. What now? Jake pulled out his camera, still miraculously intact after everything they'd been through. He showed Ka-Ro the screen, scrolling through the photos he'd taken. The creature by the river, wounded and dying. The tracking chip. The federal vehicles and armed soldiers. Ka-Ro with its family. The reunion. The settlement. The evidence of intelligence, culture, family bonds that no one could deny. The only way to save you, Jake said, knowing Ka-Ro couldn't understand the words, but hoping it would understand the intent, is to show the world you exist, not as monsters or animals, but as people, as beings who deserve protection, not persecution. Sarah moved closer, her expression troubled. Jake, you know what you're proposing. The government will deny everything. They'll destroy our credibility, maybe worse. And even if people believe us, what then? These beings will never have privacy again. Scientists, researchers, tourists, they'll all come looking. They're already being hunted, Jake said. At least this way, the hunting might stop. At least this way there's a chance. The elder creature had been watching this exchange, and now it moved to Sarah, gesturing for her attention. Another silent conversation, this one longer and more complex. When it ended, Sarah turned to Jake, her face pale. It understands what you want to do, she said quietly. It's asking what humans want from them. Why can't they just be left alone? Its people have been hiding for so long, watching human civilization spread across their ancient territories, taking everything. They've never asked for anything except to be left in peace. Jake felt the weight of that question, the centuries of fear and loss behind it. I can't speak for all humans, he said, but I can try to speak for these beings. I can try to make people understand that some things are worth protecting, worth preserving, that we don't have the right to capture and study every mystery we encounter. He pulled out Sarah's satellite phone, the device they'd been carrying as backup communication. I have the photos. Sarah has documents proving the federal program exists. Together, we can expose what's been done, make it impossible to continue. But we need to upload the evidence now, before they find us. The sound of helicopters echoed through the canyon, distant but growing closer. The creatures tensed, family groups moving to protective positions, young ones being ushered toward the deeper caves. They'd heard these sounds before, knew what they meant. Sarah took the phone, her hands shaking slightly, as she began the upload process. The satellite connection here is weak, she said. This is going to take time we might not have. Jake looked at the gathered creatures, at Ka-Ro standing with its family, at the elder watching them with ancient, knowing eyes. He thought about his daughter, about the world he wanted her to grow up in, a world with room for mystery and wonder, where compassion mattered more than conquest. The phone screen showed the upload beginning, files transferring at an agonizing crawl. Through the canyon entrance, lights appeared, vehicles approaching in formation. The final assault was beginning, and they were out of time. Jake positioned himself in front of the phone, Sarah beside him, both of them forming a human shield for the uploading evidence. Behind them, the creatures waited, caught between the instinct to flee and the need to defend their home. The military vehicles rolled into the canyon with mechanical precision, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights hunting prey. Jake kept his body positioned over the satellite phone, watching the upload progress crawl to 70%, then 75. Each percentage point felt like an eternity, each second stretched thin by the approaching threat. Colonel Brennan emerged from the lead vehicle, his tactical gear pristine despite the hours of pursuit through wilderness terrain. His eyes swept the scene with cold calculation, taking in the defensive positions of the creatures, the human shields protecting the phone, the ancient settlement that represented decades of failed intelligence gathering. "Morrison," Brennan called out, his voice amplified by the canyon walls. "You're making a mistake that will haunt you for whatever short life you have remaining. That upload can still be stopped. My people can intercept the transmission, scrub the files before they reach anyone who matters. You gain nothing by this defiance except ensuring your own destruction." Sarah's hand found Jake's, squeezing tight. The upload hit 85%. Behind them, Cairo made a low sound, communicating something to the other creatures. They shifted positions, forming a protective semicircle around the humans, their massive forms creating a living barrier between the soldiers and their targets. "They're protecting us," Sarah whispered, wonder mixing with fear in her voice. "They understand what we're trying to do." Brennan raised his hand, and soldiers moved forward, in coordinated formation, weapons raised, but not yet firing. The creatures didn't retreat. The elder stepped forward, placing itself directly in the line of approach, and the soldiers hesitated. Even through night vision equipment and tactical training, they could see the intelligence in its eyes, the deliberate nature of its stance. This wasn't an animal defending territory. This was a person protecting family. The upload reached 90%. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket, messages flooding in from the outside world even without him checking. The evidence was already spreading, already being seen, shared, discussed. The first barriers were breaking. "Sir," one of Brennan's subordinates spoke into a radio, "we're getting reports. Social media is exploding. Photos of the subjects, documents about the program. It's already viral. Command is requesting immediate clarification on our operational status." Brennan's jaw tightened, but his expression remained controlled. He stepped closer, close enough that Jake could see the calculation in his eyes, the rapid assessment of changing circumstances. "You've just painted a target on these creatures that will never disappear," Brennan said quietly. "You think exposure protects them? You've made them the most sought-after beings on the planet. Every government, every corporation, every researcher will want access. You've condemned them to a life of being hunted by different hunters." "Or we've given them a chance," Jake replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "A chance for laws, for protection, for people who care to stand between them and people like you." 95%. The phone's screen glowed in the darkness, a small beacon of hope in the tense standoff. Jake could hear more vehicles approaching, reinforcements arriving for what was supposed to be a simple cleanup operation. But the situation had already spiraled beyond Brennan's control, and they both knew it. Cairo moved beside Jake, its massive hand resting gently on his shoulder. The gesture was unmistakable, transcending species and language. Gratitude. Farewell. Understanding that whatever happened next, something fundamental had changed. The elder creature approached Sarah, touching her face with surprising gentleness, acknowledging her years of secret advocacy, her courage in leaving the program, her choice to stand with them now. The upload hit 100%. The files were gone, scattered across servers and inboxes around the world, impossible to recall or destroy. Jake looked at Brennan and saw the moment the colonel understood that his mission had failed, that the secret he'd spent his career protecting was now public knowledge. Brennan's radio crackled with urgent transmissions, orders from above, political scrambling, demands for immediate withdrawal and damage control. The colonel listened, his face hardening with each word, then finally lowered his weapon. "Stand down," he ordered his team. "All units, fall back to perimeter positions. Do not engage." The soldiers retreated slowly, maintaining formation but creating distance. The creatures remained motionless, watching, waiting for the trap they'd learned to expect from human promises. But the vehicles actually withdrew, moving back through the canyon entrance, leaving only Brennan standing in the clearing. "This isn't over," Brennan said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional power that transcended individual defeat. "You've won this moment, but the forces you've set in motion will consume everything you tried to protect. Remember that, when the consequences arrive." He turned and walked back to his vehicle, the last to leave, carrying the burden of failure back to his superiors. The sound of engines faded into the distance, leaving an eerie silence in the canyon. For a long moment, nobody moved, afraid to believe the danger had actually passed. Then Caro's child, the young one who had waited 5 years for its parent to return, made a sound of pure joy and rushed forward, wrapping small arms around its father's leg. The dam broke. The creatures began moving, checking on each other, embracing, making sounds that needed no translation. Relief, gratitude, survival. The elder approached Jake and Sarah one final time. It reached into a pouch made of woven plant fibers and withdrew something small, pressing it into Jake's palm. A carved stone, worn smooth by countless hands over what must have been generations. Symbols etched into its surface, a language no human had ever documented. Proof of their history, their culture, their right to exist as a people rather than specimens. Sarah translated the elder's final gestures, tears streaming down her face. "It says their time in this place is finished. They must go deeper, find new hidden valleys where humans rarely travel. But they will remember what you did. They will tell their children, and their children's children, that once 2 humans chose to help, rather than harm, that not all of your kind are enemies." Jake watched as the creatures gathered their few possessions, preparing for migration into deeper wilderness. Caro stood with its family, whole again, despite everything.